Cool. Morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be discussing optimizing AVD and Windows 365. And today you're joined by myself, Ricky Patel, pre-sales lead here at PowerOn, and Steve Beaumont. So in today's agenda, the aim is to be able to cover which solutions you actually need, what Microsoft are doing within their the licensing for things like AVD and Windows 365 and what it kind of really covers, the costs of using things like AVD versus Windows 365, and then based on which tooling you're planning on using, or could be both, how to kind of really optimize those costs over kind of a longer duration. So unfortunately, we may not have time to do a Q&A today, but feel free to add questions into the chat and we'll definitely follow up on them after today's session. But if we do get a chance towards the end of the session, we'll definitely try and answer them as well. So just a couple of things not to forget. Like I just mentioned, please ask questions throughout the webinar. If we run out of time, we'll send the answers along with the recording. And then keep an eye out for the follow-up emails. They'll be coming from Ryan, and it'll have all the links that we discussed from today's session, along with the slides and the recording. If you do hear us shout out oranges, it's our safe word, just in case we run out of time. So just really to keep us kind of on track on today's session. But now into the new normal, I guess. So lots of organizations have started to work in different ways. And the reason behind that is because lots of individuals are now working from home, maybe in a more of a hybrid scenario, or equally bringing in their own devices, which naturally has presented businesses with growing challenges in regards to the technologies that they use, and also in regards to things like security challenges, especially when it comes to things like the modern working from home, the hybrid kind of working, becoming the new normal, and it's all kind of really happening away from the trusted network. Other components could be employees that join the organization as contractors or temporary workers, so a level of bringing your own device is kind of increased, and that could be things like personal laptops, tablets, and phones. And lastly, from a security aspect, the main kind of concentration points for lots of IT teams and departments is to make sure that the device is secure as possible, making sure that the devices that are accessing corporate data are compliant, and then various kind of policies are in place to support the actual information that is being used on those devices. So with that, there's lots of different types of scenarios as to why Windows works really well in the cloud. In some scenarios, it could be to reduce things like the threat surface. In others, it could be more from a disaster recovery perspective, ensuring that the team is able to kind of continue to work in the scenario that their device is experiencing something like a hardware issue. And also, if employees are bringing things like their own devices, then just making sure that they are able to work on more of maybe something like a container, like a cloud PC containing all your corporate data, any certain applications that are looking to be used. And then when it comes to that hybrid working as well, so being able to provide end users the ability to access their corporate information, content, applications, and the rest of it from home, and sometimes not having to take a corporate device home with them, allowing them to work from home as well. You do have things like temporary workers. Some organizations are a bit reluctant to provide temporary workers with physical hardware, just based on things like potential damages and things like that. But using things like Windows 365 or AVD, you could really simplify and accelerate the onboarding process and equally the offboarding process for short-term workers. And then sometimes the actual hardware of the devices that are issued may not be at the highest spec, but there will definitely be roles within an organization that require some of the more high-performance computing power. So then something like AVD or Windows 365 could definitely be used again in those kind of scenarios where some of those high-performance tasks need to be created. Then you've also got components like the limited or shared physical devices. So in some scenarios where you've got frontline workers or shift workers, being able to share a physical device can sometimes be a bit of a pain or a struggle, depending on where they're based, or equally kind of if they're available at the time. also can be used for things like mergers and acquisitions. It can really be used to heavily accelerate more of a seamless transition, especially for businesses that are kind of growing and acquiring other organizations too. So over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And just mute your volume, Ricky, if you don't mind. Excellent. So the whole thing with the introduction of the AVD and the Windows 365, so virtualization or VDI is nothing new, but it's how it now forms much more of a succinct modern desktop strategy. So we have a lot of tool sets that we've been using for a while now, managing physical devices. And physical devices have always been the predominant method of actually presenting our services as an IT organization to the wider business organization. And we have this concept of personas that we've had for a while with different needs and how they access things, different timings that they do, different tasks that they perform on these devices. And while a physical device has always been the go-to because it kind of just fits for every single scenario, it's not always been either the most convenient or the most right-sized option or the most cost-effective option. So VDI has always been what's touted as that killer solution to be able to actually solve a lot of these more niche scenarios. And I say niche because it still only forms a percentage and a small percentage of your overall desktop delivery mechanisms. The difference is as we start to talk around specifically Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop, and as we move into how we can make the best usage of them in the most cost-effective way, making sure that we're not throwing out all of our common management tools and platforms, our processes, as well as the people and the understanding and the technology and the learnings of how we manage that traditional physical device is highly important. So however we deliver a desktop these days to the right type of user in the right manner is all part of this modern desktop strategy, and making sure that AVD and Windows 365 form a part of that solution rather than just some edge technology that has to be handled completely differently and disrupts the normal flow of delivery of services to users. Now, one of the biggest things that we start to see, though, is one of the reasons for moving away from some of the traditional or the original legacy VDI technologies, apart from certain manufacturers having their upses at the minute with buyouts and all the rest of it, is that transition away from having things on premises. Now, on premises, it was always great because we had total control over it, but we had a lot more to look after. So we had all that physical host, the networking, the security, the perimeters to worry about. That's how we always delivered things like VMware Horizon or your Citrix VDI platforms, your Zen desktops, or even the Microsoft RDS platforms. But trying to shift stuff now across into Windows in the cloud means that we can devolve some of that responsibility of that physical layer as we move from on-premises to IaaS. We don't have to worry about that physical layer, but we still have to worry about the actual management and control of things like the network controls. And as we keep on going up the stack, you'll notice that there's this significant curve to where Windows 365, even above Azure Virtual Desktop, means you have a lot less to do in terms of customer responsibility as Microsoft managed the rest of it. Now, there's a couple of bits in there that are in grey. So this is about choice. You can make it as simple or still as in control as you want compared to something like Azure Virtual Desktop, where you can hand over some control to Microsoft in terms of the network connections, and then you can use some of the standard baselines and stuff specifically for 365 if you want to hand off even more. And if you are investing or looking at the minute in things like the Intune suite, you can then even start to devolve even more responsibility around updates for applications and let Microsoft have that catalog that can update and make sure they're secure as well for what you're deploying on the devices. I'll hand back to yourself, Ricky.
Perfect. So when it comes to choosing what's the right path, there isn't a AVD versus Windows 365. Both solutions are very different, and we'll go into those in a moment, but they're not really kind of competing with each other, as Windows 365, like Steve mentioned, is from a simplicity perspective, very much kind of fixed price per month per user, and always kind of ready and available. It's a dedicated instance for yourselves. And we'll go into some of the licensing SKUs as to how that could work depending on the organization. And then you've also got the AVD side of things. So very much as flexible as you can do, making sure you've got things like personal pools or host pools in place, allowing you to have either full desktop streaming capabilities or equally just certain applications depending on what the use cases are. From a scalability perspective as well, you can do things like consumption-based licensing, making sure that you're only being charged for what is actually being used, and having auto-scaling in place, ensuring that if there is an increase in the usage on the AVD platform, then you do have the resources in place to kind of support that increase as well. So just delving into those a little bit more, actually. So when it comes to Windows 365, like I mentioned, it could be used for things like a desktop as a service. It is very much based on a one-to-one mapping. However, there is additional kind of SKUs you could use. But from a skills perspective, you wouldn't need to have any skills within the VDI space, and it's pretty much treated the same way that you would for a physical device. When it comes to AVD, the use cases could differ, and so you could use AVD for something like application publishing, things like multi-session, as it isn't a persistent desktop. And you do have complete control over the back end. So from the components that Steve mentioned, such as the network and the infrastructure, the customizations are very much in your control. And it is the equivalent of tools that you may have come across in the past, such as Citrix and RDS environments. And this would require you to have some skills within the VDI and the Azure space, really to ensure that you're able to kind of support it sufficiently. So, like we mentioned in the previous slide, there isn't a AVD versus Windows 365. It depends on those use cases. It depends on who's going to be using it, how they're going to be using it, and why. And based on those, you could very easily start to align in which scenarios Windows 365 may be better suited, or equally AVD as well. But it kind of really depends on those use cases, like I mentioned earlier, and kind of where users are going to be accessing their corporate content or applications from and for. But over to you, Steve, to go into Windows 365 a bit more.
Excellent. When the slides load, there we go. So, as Rick is mentioning, we've got these two main solutions we're talking about, the Windows 365 and the AVD. We keep on stressing that the Windows 365 is very much about the simple or simplified deployment, but it's more directed at a personal desktop on a one-to-one basis with some exceptions, but you pay for a fixed amount based on the CPU and the RAM and the storage size you want. So it's just very simplistic. I need this amount, I pay this amount, and I give it to X amount of users. Deployment-wise, it is as simple as licensing. There's some configuration to do first to set it up, but then you license a user and they get a virtual desktop. It can't be much more difficult than that, to be fair, as long as you have the other management aspects as you would do on a normal physical device in place. Now, the whole point, and this applies to everything, is around about the availability of these desktops. So they're designed to be run 24/7. They are just there. You don't get charged for having it on for 7 hours, 8 hours. You get charged a monthly fee, so it doesn't matter how often it's on. So it's always there whenever you need it. I use this almost exclusively now as my full-time desktop. So I can just pick up my laptop, connect to a Wi-Fi, and I'm on to my Windows 365 and go get another device. As long as I can log on to it, or I can get to a web browser, then I can get to my Windows 365 environment. Always there. I don't have to mess around closing applications. I just pick up and continue with exactly the point that I left off, unless it's been Windows Update Day, and then obviously it's going to restart and all the rest of it. Now, as we're saying, the same similar tools you're used to managing come into play with here. So if you've already got your policies in place with Intune, customizing your look and feel, your security metrics, making sure that everything's there tightened down as you would do in an enterprise, along with things like Defender Defender XDR for your security monitoring, your anti-malware management, they all immediately apply. It is still just a Windows 11 device at the end of the day. So there's nothing really majorly to change in terms of how you manage these devices. You might want to filter some stuff out. So there's obviously times where you don't want to apply things like BitLocker to a Windows 365 device because it already has encryption at rest of the infrastructure. So you'd filter some of them policies out, but there's no groundbreaking revolutionary change to how you do this. It is just Windows running on a virtualized platform. So adopt accordingly. Now, as I said a minute ago, they are primarily aimed at that whole one-to-one. I'm talking earlier on that first slide that I talked around with that different types of usage or personas for users. VDI is typically concentrated around these three main ones, and Windows 365 was originally targeted at the information worker. That are very well known. Somebody will generally tend to start early in the morning, they'll have a quick break, and they'll work through to the end of the day. On one device, single information worker. Use that, put it down, come back to it, it's their device. So that is what Windows 365 Enterprise was originally launched as, to give that information worker access to a virtualized desktop. Now, shift workers came into play where it's kind of almost a similar type of information worker, but either slightly shorter shifts or longer shifts, but with an overlapping period where people will come on. Now, in them type of situations, usually in things like call centers and stuff, the people would share the same physical equipment. You wouldn't supply every single shift worker necessarily with an individual device. So this is kind of where Windows 365 didn't quite hit that sweet spot, because you'd then in theory be paying an extra license per user for that desktop. However, as I'll move on to in a second, they did bring out a new SKU which enables these scenarios to help align with that overlap. So you're still using the one, but in a personal desktop per user, but with a grant for concurrency and overlap of time as they're using it. And then we do have this third usage pattern, which is the task worker. Think of this in scenarios where it could either be retail, where somebody just needs to jump on a PC to check some stock orders, or they're just doing some time sheets to make the rotas up for everyone. They're very ad hoc usage. They're not sat there all day at the computer. They're out on the shop floors, even in manufacturing. They're going around in the factory and stuff. They're just occasionally using the device. But you might have multiple people within that shift that need to access a device to do a particular task on that device and then clear off and do the rest of their work. And these scenarios don't typically fit the Windows 365 scenarios at the moment, and they would more align to a more of an AVD style scenario where you can have that concurrency without worrying about the individual user costs. So mentioning on them licensing models, so that Windows 365 Enterprise is that very predictable licensing, like we say, per user, per month, regardless of how much time that they spend on that device. So if you know that a contractor or full-time employee is going to be spending a decent chunk of time on a device, then it makes sense to say, well, it's predictable, we know they're going to use it. Absolutely makes sense to give them a license for that month, regardless of just how much they're going to use it, as long as they're breaching a certain time. If they're only going to use it for 5 minutes, that's kind of debatable, and that's where we'll talk about some of the benefits of the AVD side. But good 3-4 hours at any one time, then that would absolutely make sense, especially as you get up to the 7 and the 8 hour work days. The front line is what I was talking around on them shift-based scenarios. So this is where we can actually assign one Cloud PC frontline license for up to 3 employees. So when you do have that overlap and they come on, they'll do their work for, I don't know, a 7-hour shift, 12-hour shift, and the next person comes in, that same idea of they're sharing a physical PC, they're now sharing a physical Cloud PC license where they can log on, they get a little bit of time of overlap, and as long as that other one goes off, then they start to get then they use it on their shift. You can't have all 3 employees on at the same time. That is not what it's designed for. It's designed to allow a slight bit of concurrency as the shifts overlap, and then they continue to use it in a one-to-one style model. On the AVD space, so this is still about being able to access it anywhere, but in my personal opinion, it's much more of an interesting scenario when you start to use it in a multi-session mode and or start to look at app streaming rather than just presenting a full-blown physical desktop. If you are finding that people are wanting to log on and they need their own bespoke apps, or they're heavily using the CPU counts, or they want to be able to personalize it, or heaven forbid, and this is just an extreme example, they needed to have more of such of admin rights to be able to change bits and pieces like the developers and stuff, definitely go and look more towards Windows 365. There are ways to do it in AVD, where you start to do personal desktop deployments, but then you start to break down a lot of the cost effectiveness conversations. Where the cost effectiveness starts to come in on AVD is when you start to have multiple people on the one host, so multi-session, so you can get density within the actual confines of what you're paying for the compute slice, or you start to look at just deploying out applications. So the usage pattern again is a little bit less than having to run the full desktop with multiple apps open, and then you're just noticing that they're only using applications on an ad hoc basis. It changes the compute and the resource conversation of how much power you need behind the thing, which allows you to have better density and a better cost overall on this side. The other good thing is, for the majority of customers, the licensing cost is included within your M365 licensing today. There is not an extra flat fee. We're not talking about the traditional days of RDS and terminal services, and even with Citrix over the top of it, where you needed to have CALs per user. That's gone. The equivalent CAL is included within your M365 licenses. There are some other scenarios where if you're accessing it from like a Windows home device and stuff, you need to start thinking about potential VDA licenses. But if you are accessing it and the user is covered, the majority of times the licensing is already there for the access models that you need for this. But that does mean that the majority of your cost, or the way you think about cost for AVD, is through the consumption of resources. So we're talking about how much of the size of the VMs that you're deploying in Azure in terms of the CPU and the memory and your storage. Now, there are ways that we'll go into in a little bit on this one that we very heavily start to focus around auto-scaling this solution. So unlike Windows 365, where it's just like, yep, one-to-one, we provision one, we don't care about how often you use it, we are very conscious with AVD about how often users are using it, what the resource capacity is on that pool of servers, and can we reduce the amount to cope with the demand and then scale it up in time, so we're not continuously just paying for VMs being sat there doing nothing. Good news is, yet again, this is all still able to be controlled with the same controls, the same tool sets, Intune, Defender XDR, etc. You can now do this as a pure Entra ID only join solution as well. And you can or can't have connections, or can or don't have to have connections back to your on-premises network, depending on your needs there as well. So we get the flexibility of choice of how we want to deploy this. It can be even a different or a similar manner to how we deploy Windows 365. Now, very conscious of time, so speeding through some of these bits. There is obviously savings to be made from migrating from your on-premises RDS solutions to AVD. Obviously, the infrastructure costs, and basically if you are looking at having to refresh hardware and stuff, that is a good time to actually look at this in the cloud. It'll be a technology that you're already fairly familiar with the RDS technology platforms, with just some obviously modernization and ways to do it in the cloud. but making sure that you adopt the whole idea around the right sizing and the auto scaling to only pay for what you need on that one. Leveraging multi-session is an absolute recommended way to go when looking at AVD. Don't just be giving out one-to-one desktops. That's where we need to look at Windows 365. And there's obviously the reduction in cost on things like RDS cows potentially if you're already on the correct M365 licensing. The total cost of ownership is a huge one though for me. So traditionally managing both the Citrix environments and the RDS environments and having to worry about your brokers, your licensing servers, your web access gateways, all of that lot is handed off to Microsoft. They have all that lot as platform as a service, or software as a service in this case. All you do is have to worry about the actual hosts, what applications are running on them, and the underlying pool structure of how you carve up what users access which pools and what applications installed on it and your networking side. The more you dive into this and the more you automate things with things like your Bicep and your ARM templates, Terraform even, and then using Azure DevOps to deploy this allows you to reduce that total cost of ownership as it becomes much more of an automated process of managing and deploying these things. Do want to dive into this quickly, even though we are running very short on time. So these are some of the most common ways to reduce the cost of the AVD platform. Notice I'm not talking much about reducing the cost of the Windows 365 platform. That is not something that can be easily tweaked. Well, you cannot tweak it to reduce costs. You have to look at a licensing perspective and see who actually needs it and whether they're better suited for a Windows 365 frontline license or an enterprise license until we get any other form of licensing SKUs come out. However, that is then a balance between assessing the cost of somebody running it on Windows 365 versus putting them onto an AVD instance. And that can be a cost benefit side where you can actually move some people across to the AVD side. AVD's biggest areas to look at for making sure that you reduce the cost: auto scaling. Hands down, the easiest thing to put in, and also the one that can actually reduce consumption costs quite significantly. If you've got a host pool of 10 host VMs and you find that you've actually only got 10 users on and they all fit on one box, why on earth would you want to pay to have 9 VMs sat there running 24/7? There are technologies within the platform now that will allow you to go and turn them off, and at the very least just have them turned off so you're not paying for anything but the storage. Then you can start to go down the stack of looking at how you put in even more automation or even manual tasks at first, just to make it even more efficient. So only creating VMs when the actual scale is needed, using things like Azure Image Builder and DevOps pipelines, allows you to monitor for how many users are on a single box. Is it hitting 90% usage on either CPU or memory? And then get the pipelines to build another session host at that point, bring it into the pool so users can continue to be evenly distributed. Again, much better way than saying, well, we always have 20 VMs sat around just in case it's a snow day and we need to have 200 people log on. But our normal usage pattern is 10 users logged on. I'm using small numbers because it's easier for my maths brain to actually compute, but you can scale that up to hundreds of thousands of users if need be. OS disk auto scaling is an interesting one. Now, again, depending on your usage profile for what you need for the best performance or the best user experience, typically you'll end up on premium SSDs at some point around, especially for the OS and stuff, to give you that oomph to be able to load applications. Again, though, when the VMs are turned off, why are we paying for premium storage when there's no IOPS requirements? Look at using automation to convert them to standard disks, just save on some storage costs again. Similarly, with making sure that we reduce the disk size, and this goes across both the OS disk storage and, in some respects, the FS storage logics. If we can do little tricks like saying, well, fine, we don't need 128 gigs disks for the OS. We can cope with 64 gig. On a normal physical desktop, I would never recommend that. On a virtual desktop platform, if you put the right patch management methodologies in, and I'm not talking patching, I'm talking tear down and rebuilds, you can generally get away with it. But again, usage case scenarios will need looking at. You might have large applications that need large temp files, etc. It's all to be experimented with. But again, a nice, easy way to save half the costs between a 64 gig and 128 gig disk. FS Logics, again, it's all about the storage. Because they are dynamically expanding VHDs, over time they will grow and grow and grow. But if people have put large amounts of data on there and then deleted that data, it doesn't automatically reclaim some of that space. So just looking at ways that we can actually help compact them disks so we're not storing just white space makes a lot more sense to, again, reduce the costs. And then reserved instances. This, when you have your deployment fully ready, you've gone through your design, your pilots, and you've actually got production, well-designed infrastructure, switching then into reserved instances and basically committing to Microsoft to say, yeah, we know we're going to be using this solution for the next 1, 2, 3 years, then you will get a substantial discount compared to the normal pay-as-you-go rates. So it's one of them areas where you know that this isn't going to be a transient server for a small-time project. Pay reserved instances and receive a significant benefit on the actual costs on that side. Ricky.
Cool. So where do you start with this modern VDI deployment journey? We often say to start with a proof of concept, and the proof of concept should really help to demonstrate the functionality and the potential benefits of which scenario, or is it both, that are going to suit your end user's needs. Once you're happy with being able to kind of trial out some of those toolings across your internal team, maybe potentially, you can then start to spread that out to more of a pilot test group, making sure that the tooling that has been pieced together can get thorough testing. You can then get some reporting back on the feedback from the individuals, really making sure that the right decisions are being made before you start leaning to more of a production-based deployment. And the production-based deployment is really kind of at that critical stage of the deployment, making sure that once you've kind of gone through the journey of proof of concept, pilot, and now into production, that any final kind of tweaks that need to be made, any kind of final testing or updates to the revisions are made at the necessary times, making sure that you do have the most reliable and efficient deployment that you could have. So what we're doing is we are offering quick start workshops, and that is to spend one-to-one time with one of our experts to really map out the needs and the use cases that you may have within the environment, to receive more personalized recommendations and to kind of go through more of the areas that we've discussed today in more depth, and looking at how we could potentially work with you to optimize costs and the resource usages. And being a registrant of today's webinar, you will receive a 65% discount, meaning instead of paying £1,499 for this session, you would only be paying £499. But we'll include more information in regards to that workshop along with the recording. And then any useful information such as things like the newsletters, or if you want to speak to us directly, feel free to hit reply to any of the emails that you see. But really, thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll send out the recording and the slides within the next 24 hours, and feel free to share them with your teams.
Awesome. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks.